If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching from. Continuing, the mirrored towers of the London Financial Tower reflected the afternoon sun as Richard Morrison crossed the spacious marble lobby toward his office. At 52, the Mancunian businessman based in London was the embodiment of British success. Owner of Morrison Developments, one of the country's largest construction companies, Richard had transformed the business, started by his father, into an empire that stretched across the national territory. "Good morning, Mr. Morrison," the receptionist greeted with a nervous smile. Richard merely nodded without looking up from his mobile phone. This was how his world worked. People existed to serve him, not to be noticed. On the 30th floor, a meeting awaited him. Suited executives immediately rose when he entered the conference room. The only one who remained seated was Paul Miller, his partner and university friend. Only Paul could afford to defy Richard's unwritten rules of hierarchy. "You're late," Paul commented, checking his watch. "And you're still the only one with the guts to tell me that," Richard retorted with a cold smile. "Let's get to it. The Mayfair development has been stalled for 2 weeks. I want to know who's going to pay for this." The meeting proceeded like so many others. Richard dictating orders, cutting off explanations and deciding the professional fate of people as if choosing a dinner dish. By the end, 2 directors were fired. No one dared to question him. "You could have waited until the end of the month," Paul commented, as the two headed to Richard's private office. "Mark has 3 children in school." "And now he'll have time to get to know them better," Richard replied, pouring himself a whiskey. "Inefficiency has a price, Paul. You more than anyone should know that." The phone rang. It was Julia, his wife. Richard answered impatiently. "I'm in a meeting, Ju." "Gabriel's presentation is today. You promised you'd come." Julia's voice sounded tired, like someone who already knew the answer. "Impossible. I have dinner with investors. Tell him I'll make it up to him on the weekend." "Like you made up for Claire's birthday or Beatrice's graduation. Richard, you can't—" He hung up. Paul watched him with an expression that mixed disapproval and resignation. "One day those calls will stop coming," his partner commented. "And you'll miss them." Richard ignored the comment. His family was just another one of the many departments of his life that needed to be managed from a distance. Julia understood that when they married. The children would eventually understand too. At the end of the day, driving his imported Porsche through the streets of London, Richard reflected on the empire he had built. What began as a small construction company in the Manchester suburbs now employed over 5,000 people. His name was among the most powerful in the country. It was worth some sacrifices. His mobile rang again. It was Gabriel, his 15-year-old son. Richard hesitated, but answered via the car's Bluetooth system. "Dad, are you coming to my presentation? Mum said you're busy, but I'm going to play that song you taught me. Remember?" His son's voice brought back a distant memory. Richard at 10, sitting by the edge of a reservoir near Bath, next to his friend Mikey, as everyone called him in the village. The 2 boys singing, dreaming of the future. The song was an old folk tune that Mikey's grandfather had composed, never recorded, passed down from generation to generation. "Dad, are you there?" Gabriel's voice brought him back. Richard looked at the dashboard clock, 7:40 p.m. The presentation would start at 8 p.m. Dinner with the Japanese investors was scheduled for 9 p.m. "I need to hang up, Gabriel. I have an important commitment. We'll play that song together on the weekend." Silence on the other end of the line lasted a few seconds. "Sure, no problem. Good night, Dad." Richard hung up, sped up the car, and ran a red light. On the radio, the announcer reported traffic on the A40 Westway. Annoyed, he decided to take a shortcut through the city center. Rain began to fall, making the asphalt slippery. His mobile rang once more. It was Paul. "The Japanese postponed until tomorrow. Flight issues. You can still make Gabriel's presentation." Richard felt a pang of relief. Perhaps he could surprise his son. It had been a long time since he'd seen Gabriel play. The boy had talent, though Richard rarely praised him. Demandingness was his language of affection. He accelerated even more, zigzagging between cars. The rain grew heavier. On the radio, that very old folk tune was now playing. A strange coincidence. He thought again of Mikey. "You'll kill yourself one day with all this haste, Richard." Mikey's voice echoed in his memory. They were 12 at the time, and Richard had always been the more impulsive of the two. The irony of fate was that it was Mikey who left first, an accident in the same reservoir where they used to sing. Richard survived because Mikey pulled him to the bank before the current swept him away. He never knew how to swim well. Mikey did, but couldn't save himself. The image of his friend disappearing into the murky waters never completely left him. Over time, he learned to push it into a distant corner of his mind, the same corner where he kept Julia's complaints, the disappointment in his children's eyes, and occasional crises of conscience about his business decisions. The traffic light ahead turned amber. In normal conditions, Richard would have accelerated, but the memory of Mikey made him hesitate. He slowed down. That's when he saw, crossing the pedestrian crossing, a boy carrying what looked like a guitar on his back. For a bizarre instant, he thought he was seeing Mikey, the same curly hair, the same posture. The distraction lasted only a second, but it was enough. A lorry appeared from the side, skidding on the wet road. Richard swerved sharply, trying to avoid the collision. The Porsche spun on the asphalt, hit the curb and overturned. The impact was violent. When paramedics arrived, Richard was unconscious, trapped in the wreckage. The last sound he heard before losing consciousness was the end of that old folk tune, inexplicably loud on the radio of the destroyed car. 3 days later at St. Thomas's Hospital, the medical team gave the family the diagnosis: severe traumatic brain injury, multiple fractures, internal bleeding. Richard Morrison had entered a deep coma, and the prospects were not encouraging. Julia, sitting by her husband's bedside, observed the now tranquil face of the man who, even when present, had always been absent. In the corridor, Gabriel cried silently, embraced by his sisters Claire and Beatrice. "How long will it last?" Julia asked the doctor. Dr. Ferdinand Thorne, chief neurologist, took a deep breath before answering, "Mrs. Morrison, we cannot predict. It could be days, weeks, months, or years. What I can say is that Mr. Morrison's life as you knew it will never be the same. What none of them could imagine was that it would take exactly 5 years for those eyes to open again, and that, when it happened, it would not be through science, but by something medicine could never explain." Chapter 2. In the shadow of silence, St. Thomas's Hospital had become a second home for the Morrison family. 5 years is enough time to know every nurse by name, every shift change, every procedure. Enough time for hope to turn into routine, and then into a kind of resignation that resembles grief, but without the final farewell. Julia Morrison, now 47, parked her car in the same spot she had used for 5 years. She greeted the security guard with familiarity and headed for the elevator. On the 4th floor, the extended intensive care unit, she turned right automatically. "Good morning, Mrs. Morrison," greeted Denise, the head nurse who had cared for Richard since the first year. "Dr. Ferdinand asked to see you in his office first." Julia felt a tightening in her chest. Normally, calls from the neurologist meant news, rarely good. "Any changes?" she asked, trying to maintain composure. "The doctor prefers to speak personally." In Dr. Ferdinand Thorne's office, Julia found not only the neurologist, but also Dr. Edward Anderson, a medical ethics specialist, and Beatrice, her eldest daughter, now 26. A law graduate, Beatrice had gradually taken over the management of the family business, becoming a more humanized version of her father. "Mum, I asked Dr. Ferdinand to wait for you," Beatrice said, getting up to hug her mother. Julia noticed her daughter's red eyes. She had cried recently. "What happened?" "Richard, Mrs. Morrison," Dr. Ferdinand began, indicating a chair for her to sit. "As you know, we performed a new battery of tests last month. The results arrived yesterday." He opened a folder with various graphs and MRI images. "For the past 5 years, we have monitored your husband's brain activity, always looking for any sign of improvement. Unfortunately, the new tests confirm what we already suspected. There is no significant neurological activity." "What exactly does that mean?" Julia asked, though she already knew the answer. "It means there is no prospect of recovery," the doctor replied gently. "The Richard you knew no longer exists. From a neurological point of view." Beatrice squeezed her mother's hand tightly. "But his body still responds. His heart beats, he breathes with the help of machines," Julia argued, repeating the same words she had used countless times over the years. "Basic neurological reflexes remain, yes," Dr. Ferdinand agreed. "But the cerebral cortex, the part that makes us who we are, shows no signs of activity compatible with consciousness." Dr. Edward, the ethics specialist, intervened with a calm voice. Mrs. Morrison, we understand that this is an impossible decision for any family. We are not here to pressure, only to present the medical reality and discuss the options. Options? Julia repeated the word as if it were foreign. Yes, Dr. Edward continued. The family can choose to maintain life support indefinitely or consider discontinuing life support measures, Beatrice completed, her voice choked. Mum, we've talked about this before. Indeed, they had talked, several times over the years. Beatrice, always the most pragmatic, had been the first to mention the possibility back in the 3rd year. Gabriel, the youngest, now 20 and a music student at the University of Manchester, had always been the most resistant. Claire, the middle child, remained divided, as in almost everything in life. You're asking me to let my husband go, Julia said, feeling the words weigh in her mouth. We are presenting the medical conclusions and the ethical and legal options, Dr. Edward corrected. The decision is the family's and only the family's. Julia closed her eyes. She remembered Richard before the accident, the ruthless, workaholic, distant man, the husband who was rarely present, even when physically at home, the father who missed school presentations and birthdays. Ironically, in the last 5 years, Richard had been more present in the family's life than in the previous 20 years. His condition had united them in a strange way. Beatrice abandoned plans to study abroad to take care of her father's business. Gabriel, who barely spoke to his father before, now regularly came to play cello in the hospital room, believing that music could reach Richard where words could not. Claire, who had always desperately sought her father's approval, visited daily, talking about her day as if he could hear. I need to talk to Gabriel and Claire, Julia finally said. We need to decide together. Of course, Doctor, Ferdinand agreed. We will take all the time you need. That night, the Morrison family gathered at Julia's apartment in Kensington. Gabriel had flown from Manchester especially for the occasion. Claire, who lived with her mother, prepared dinner, though no one really had an appetite. So that's it, Gabriel said after hearing Beatrice's explanation of the meeting with the doctors. They're suggesting we give up on him. It's not giving up, Gabriel, Beatrice countered. It's accepting the medical reality. Dad isn't coming back. You don't know that. Gabriel raised his voice, something rare for the usually calm young man. There are cases of people who woke up after years. Exceptional cases, without the level of brain damage Dad suffered, Beatrice argued. I've read all the articles, consulted international specialists. I'm not taking this lightly, Gabriel. Claire, who had remained silent until then, intervened. What if it were him in one of our places? What would Dad decide? The question hung heavy over the table. Richard Morrison was known for his cold objectivity, his ability to make difficult decisions without hesitation. He would have signed the papers the same day, Julia replied, surprising everyone with her frankness. Your father never believed in prolonging the inevitable. He was pragmatic to the core. Then why did we wait 5 years? Claire questioned. Because we are not him, Julia simply replied. Because despite everything, we love him. The silence that followed was broken by Gabriel's mobile phone ringing. It was Rachel, his girlfriend, checking how he was. As the young man stepped away to answer, Beatrice approached her mother. We need to make a decision, Mum, however painful it may be. Julia nodded slowly. 5 years earlier, when Richard was hospitalized, she was a socialite devoted to her family, who accepted her husband's absence as part of the package that came with the Morrison name. Now she was a different woman. She had gone back to studying, did volunteer work, learned to manage her own life. Did you know your father and I hadn't slept in the same room for almost 10 years before the accident? Julia revealed, surprising her daughters. We lived like partners in a company called the Morrison family. I accepted it, because it was easier than facing the truth. Gabriel returned to the room, putting away his phone. What did I miss? Nothing, Claire quickly replied. We were just talking. I think we should vote, Beatrice suggested, always methodical. We are a family, we decide together. Julia shook her head. We're not going to vote on your father's life. We're going to talk, reflect, and when everyone is ready, we'll make the decision together, without rushing. In the following weeks, each of the children spent time alone with their father in the hospital. Gabriel played his most recent compositions. Claire read aloud the poems Richard never had time to hear. Beatrice discussed the company's business, seeking an approval that would never come. Julia watched her children say goodbye in their own way. She herself had said goodbye years earlier, in the silence of night spent beside that mechanically breathing body. Finally, on a rainy May afternoon, exactly 5 years and 2 months after the accident, the Morrison family gathered in Dr. Ferdinand's office. "We've decided," Julia announced, holding Gabriel's and Claire's hands, while Beatrice kept her hand on her mother's shoulder. "We've scheduled it for next Friday. We all want to be present." Dr. Ferdinand nodded respectfully. "We will do everything with dignity and comfort. Mr. Morrison will not feel pain, and you will be able to be by his side the entire time." "Thank you, Doctor," Julia replied, feeling a strange peace after so much time of uncertainty. "Now, if you'll excuse us, we're going to spend the night with Richard. We have many stories to tell him." What no one could foresee was that fate had other plans for the Morrison family, and that the eve of the farewell would bring an unexpected visitor who would change everything. Chapter 3. The Melody of Awakening. Thursday dawned with a sky unusual for London, completely clear, a deep blue that seemed to defy the metropolis's usual pollution. It was the eve of the date set for the procedure to turn off the machines that kept Richard Morrison alive. At the hospital, Julia organized the personal belongings that had accumulated in the room over 5 years. Family photographs, the antique watch Richard had inherited from his father, books she had read to him during countless afternoons, small fragments of a life in suspension. "Mrs. Julia, I brought you some coffee." It was Denise, the head nurse, who after so many years had become almost a friend. "Did you sleep here again?" Julia accepted the cup with a tired smile. "I wanted to cherish every moment." Denise nodded with understanding. After years in the ICU, she knew the farewell process well. "Are your children coming today?" "Beatrice will come in the afternoon. Claire is on her way. Gabriel arrives from Manchester late afternoon," Julia replied. Observing Richard's serene face, he seemed merely asleep, like so many mornings when she woke before him. "You know, Denise, I spent so many years waiting for him to come home. Now I'm preparing to let him go." At Morrison Developments, Beatrice conducted her last meeting before taking a few days off. As CEO, she had transformed the company in recent years, gradually moving it away from the aggressive practices of her father's era. "Quarterly reports show sustainable growth across all sectors," Beatrice explained to the shareholders when her mobile vibrated. It was a message from Toby, her boyfriend. "Stay strong, my love. I'll be with you tomorrow." Beatrice felt a knot in her throat. She finished the presentation quickly and retreated to her office, the same one that had belonged to Richard. Unlike her father, she had humanized the space, adding plants, photos, and even a small bookshelf. The only item she kept intact was the old leather chair where Richard spent hours working. "Your meeting with the Alvarado construction team has been rescheduled for Monday," Sandra, her assistant, informed her, entering the room. Noticing Beatrice's expression, she added, "Is everything all right?" "Tomorrow we're turning off my father's life support," Beatrice replied, feeling the reality of those words for the first time. "After 5 years, we're finally saying goodbye." Sandra, who had worked at the company since Richard's time, approached hesitantly. "Your father was a difficult man, Beatrice, but he built a solid company. And he raised you, and you're making this company better than it ever was." Beatrice smiled through tears. "Thank you, Sandra. You always know what to say." At the University of Manchester Conservatory, Gabriel Morrison rehearsed one last time the piece he intended to play for his father the next day. It wasn't a classical composition, but a simple melody Richard had taught him as a child. A song that, according to his father, he had learned from a childhood friend. "You're playing differently today," commented Professor John Charles, who had passed by the studio to pick up some sheet music. "There's a sadness in your interpretation." Gabriel lowered the cello bow. "Tomorrow is a difficult day for my family." John Charles, who knew about Richard's condition, nodded understandingly. "Music has the power to express what words cannot, Gabriel. Your father will have the honor of leaving with your music in his heart." At Manchester Airport, Gabriel boarded the 5 p.m. flight to London, his cello carefully stowed in a special case. In his pocket, he carried the yellowed sheet music of that song, handwritten by Richard himself years earlier. Claire, meanwhile, spent the afternoon in Hyde Park, a place she frequented when she needed to organize her thoughts. At 23, she had always been the most sensitive and introspective of the Morrison family. While Beatrice inherited her father's determination, and Gabriel his rare musical talent, Claire possessed an artistic sensibility that led her to study visual arts. Sitting in the shade of a tree, she sketched her father's face in her notebook. Not Richard the businessman, imposing and distant, but the man she had glimpsed in rare moments of vulnerability, when he found her crying after a heartbreak and not knowing how to console her, simply sat beside her in silence, or when she caught him watching Gabriel play, with a pride he had never known how to express in words. "Is that your dad?" The question came from a child's voice. Claire looked up and saw a boy of about 10, observing her drawing. He wore simple clothes, faded jeans and a white t-shirt. He carried what looked like a small guitar on his back. "Yes," she replied, surprised by the child's perception. "How did you know?" The boy shrugged. "By the way you're drawing, with longing." There was something familiar about that boy, Claire thought, the dark, lively eyes, the curly hair falling over his forehead. "Do you play guitar?" she asked, pointing to the instrument. The boy smiled, showing a missing front tooth. "Yes, I learned from my grandfather. He composed many songs." "My brother is a musician too," Claire commented. "He plays the cello." "Cello is beautiful," the boy replied, "big and full of feeling like a beating heart." Claire smiled at the poetic comparison. "You're very observant for your age. What's your name?" "Michael," the boy replied. "And you?" "Claire Morrison." A fleeting expression of recognition crossed the boy's face, so brief that Claire thought she had imagined it. "I have to go now," Michael said, adjusting the guitar strap on his back. "I hope your dad gets better." Before Claire could reply that she hadn't mentioned her father's condition, the boy was already walking away, blending into the people strolling through the park. That night, the Morrison family gathered at Julia's apartment for an intimate dinner. It was the eve of the farewell, and none of them wanted to be alone. "You know what's strange?" Gabriel commented as he helped Claire set the table. "Dad has never been as present in our lives as he has been in these 5 years he's been in a coma." Claire nodded. "It's true. Before, he was almost a stranger. Now, we know parts of him we never saw before," Beatrice completed, entering the room with a bottle of wine. "I found his old diaries while organizing the office. Did you know he used to write poetry when he was young?" Julia, who was listening to the conversation from the kitchen, smiled melancholically. The Richard her children discovered in the last 5 years was the same man she had fallen in love with decades ago, before ambition and power transformed him. Dinner was quiet, punctuated by shared memories and plans for the next day. They decided that each would have a moment alone with Richard before the final procedure. "I met a strange boy today in the park," Claire commented as they had coffee on the balcony. "He looked at my drawing and immediately knew it was Dad." "Children have that perception," Julia commented. "It wasn't just that. He said he hoped Dad would get better, but I hadn't mentioned he was sick, and there was something familiar about him. I can't explain it." "What was his name?" Gabriel asked, suddenly interested. "Michael." "Why?" Gabriel paled slightly. "It's nothing. Just curious." Later, when everyone had retired, Gabriel showed Beatrice the sheet music he was carrying. "Dad taught me this song when I was 8, he explained. "He said he learned it from his best childhood friend, a boy named Michael, who had an accident when they were 12. Beatrice examined the yellowed sheet music. At the top, written in pencil, was the title, Reservoir Song, Michael and Richard Bath, 1982. "I never heard Dad talk about that friend," Beatrice commented. "He rarely mentioned it," Gabriel replied. "He only talked about it once when he caught me playing this melody. He said Michael was like a brother, and that he died trying to save him from drowning. I think Dad never forgave himself for that." The next morning, the family arrived early at the hospital. Dr. Ferdinand received them with his usual professional compassion, explaining again how the procedure would be. There would be sedation to ensure comfort, although the doctors believed Richard had no awareness of the situation. "We will give you all the time you need to say goodbye," the doctor concluded. "The procedure is scheduled for 3 p.m., but we can adjust if you need more time." One by one, they entered the room for their private moments of farewell. Beatrice spoke about the company, promising to honor her father's legacy, transforming it into something he could be proud of. Claire showed the drawings she had made of him over the years, including the sketch from the previous day in the park. Julia sat by the bedside, holding Richard's hand, silently recalling the journey they had shared. Gabriel was the last. He set up his cello in the small available space and prepared to play his father's childhood song. That's when the unexpected happened. The room door opened, And there, standing in the doorway, was a boy with a small guitar on his back, the same boy Claire had met in the park the day before. "Michael!" Claire exclaimed, recognizing him immediately. The boy did not answer. He looked directly at Richard, as if no one else was in the room. "How did you get in here?" Beatrice asked, recovering from the initial surprise. "This is a restricted area." The boy remained silent, advancing slowly toward the bed. There was something hypnotic in his movements, a quiet determination that none of them dared to interrupt. "Let him be," Julia murmured, feeling an inexplicable shiver run down her spine. Michael positioned himself next to Gabriel, took the small guitar from his back and, without saying a word, began to tune the strings. He looked at Gabriel, who was still holding the cello, and made an almost imperceptible gesture with his head. Instinctively, Gabriel understood. He positioned the bow on the strings and began to play the melody from the yellowed sheet music. Seconds later, Michael's guitar accompanied him, adding layers to the simple song. The music filled the room, sweet and melancholic. Claire recognized the melody. Her father would sometimes whistle it distractedly, while working at home on the rare weekends he didn't go to the office. That's when the machines began to register changes. First subtle, then more pronounced. The heart monitor showed accelerated beats. The electroencephalogram, which for years had shown only minimal activity, began to display different patterns. "What's happening?" Beatrice whispered, watching the monitors. Nurse Denise quickly entered the room, drawn by the alarms. Her eyes widened as she saw the numbers on the monitors. "I'll call Dr. Ferdinand," she said, hurrying out. Gabriel and Michael continued playing, seemingly oblivious to the growing commotion. The melody reached its peak, the notes of the guitar and cello intertwining in perfect harmony. Then it happened. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, Richard's right-hand fingers began to move. A slight tremor, then a more defined movement, as if trying to follow the rhythm of the music. Julia was the first to notice. "Look!" she exclaimed, pointing to her husband's hand. At that moment, Dr. Ferdinand rushed into the room, followed by two other doctors. "Please step back," he asked, quickly moving to the bed. But no one moved. The music continued, now more intense. A soft light, perhaps just a reflection of the setting sun through the window, seemed to envelop the room. And then the impossible happened. Richard Morrison's eyes, closed for 5 long years, began to open, slowly, like someone awakening from a deep sleep. "My God!" Julia exclaimed, bringing her hands to her mouth. Dr. Ferdinand and his team watched in astonishment. There was no medical explanation for what they were witnessing. Richard blinked several times, his eyes adjusting to the light. His gaze, initially unfocused, wandered around the room until it landed on the boy with the guitar. A flash of recognition lit up his face. "Michael?" he whispered, his voice hoarse from the long silence. But when everyone turned to the boy, he was no longer there, as if he had disappeared into thin air, without anyone seeing him leave. Only his guitar lay on the floor, as tangible proof that it had not been a collective hallucination. Richard tried to sit up, but his body, weakened by years of immobility, barely responded. "Where is he?" he asked, his voice broken. "Where is Michael?" Julia, openly weeping, hugged her husband. "Richard, you're back. You really came back." Dr. Ferdinand, recovering from the initial shock, quickly began to examine Richard's vital signs. This is unprecedented," he murmured, checking Richard's responsive pupils. "In my entire career, I've never seen anything like it." Gabriel, still holding the cello, stared at the guitar left by the boy. He slowly approached and picked it up, turning it in his hands. On the back of the instrument, engraved in dark wood, were the initials MS. "Michael Sterling," Gabriel whispered, remembering the full name his father had mentioned only once. Richard, still confused but increasingly conscious, looked around, recognizing his family's faces, noticing how they had changed. "How long?" he finally asked. 5 years, Beatrice replied, holding his hand. "You were in a coma for 5 years, Dad." Richard closed his eyes for a moment, absorbing the information. When he opened them again, there was a surprising lucidity in them for someone who had just emerged from a prolonged coma. "I saw him," he said with certainty. "I saw Michael every day. He was with me there, wherever I was." The doctors exchanged worried glances, interpreting the words as post-coma confusion. But the Morrison family knew that something extraordinary had happened in that room. Something science could never explain. And as the mysterious boy's guitar rested on Gabriel's lap, the first rays of the setting sun streamed through the window, bathing the room in a golden light that seemed to say, "This is just the first page of a new story." Chapter 4. Rebirth. The first rays of the London morning filtered through the windows of St. Thomas's Hospital, illuminating the room where Richard Morrison, defying all medical prognoses, sat in bed fully conscious. 2 weeks had passed since his inexplicable awakening, and the medical team was still struggling to understand what they called the most extraordinary case in British neurology. "The exams don't make sense, Doctor," Ferdinand explained, examining the latest CT scans in Julia's presence. 3 weeks ago there was no significant brain activity. Now it's as if his brain has completely regenerated. "Is there any medical explanation?" Julia asked, watching Richard through the glass window as he performed physiotherapy exercises. "Officially, we'd say there was an extremely rare spontaneous remission. But honestly, Mrs. Morrison," the doctor hesitated, lowering his voice, "in almost 30 years of my career, I've never witnessed anything similar. If you asked me as a man, not as a doctor, I'd call it a miracle," Julia completed. Dr. Ferdinand nodded discreetly. "The important thing now is recovery. Physically, he's progressing surprisingly well. Muscle atrophy is less severe than we would expect after 5 years of immobility. Cognitively, all functions are intact. Memory, reasoning, language, all preserved." "And what about the visions he reports?" The doctor sighed. "From a clinical point of view, we could classify them as hallucinations resulting from brain trauma. But the boy was really there," Julia affirmed. "We all saw him. And he disappeared without explanation," the doctor added with evident discomfort. "As a scientist, I must seek rational explanations. As a human being, I'm as perplexed as you are." Inside the room, Richard finished his physiotherapy session. At 57, his body had lost considerable weight, but maintained surprising strength. The determination he once directed toward business was now entirely focused on his recovery. "Excellent progress, Mr. Morrison," praised Teresa, the physiotherapist. "You're weeks ahead of schedule." Richard nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. Since he awoke, a single obsession dominated him: finding the boy Michael. Not the childhood friend he had lost decades ago, but the mysterious boy with the guitar, who in some impossible way seemed to be the same person. "My daughter Claire met this boy in Hyde Park the day before he appeared here," Richard commented, holding the guitar the boy had left behind. The instrument rarely left his side. "He must be somewhere in the city." Teresa exchanged glances with Nurse Denise, both accustomed to Richard's fixations, as the medical team discreetly called them. "You need to focus on your recovery now," Denise gently suggested. "Your family has hired investigators to look for the boy." Indeed, at Richard's insistent request, Beatrice had hired a private investigation agency. So far, however, there were no results. No record of a boy named Michael with the description provided in shelters or schools in the Hyde Park area. The guitar, examined by specialists, was a handmade model with no serial number, impossible to trace. In the afternoon, Gabriel arrived for his daily visit. Since his father's awakening, the young musician had temporarily suspended his course in Manchester to be in London. "I brought something for you," Gabriel said, handing his father a folder with sheet music. "I transcribed that melody we played that day, Michael's song." Richard opened the folder with eagerness, examining the carefully transcribed notes. "It's perfect, son. Exactly as Michael and I composed it in Bath." Gabriel sat on the edge of the bed. "Dad, you never told me much about that childhood friend." Richard closed his eyes for a moment, diving into memories he had tried to suppress for decades. "Michael Sterling was the son of the housekeeper who worked at my grandparents' house in Bath. We spent summers there. I had everything: toys, clothes, privileges. Michael had nothing but an old guitar he inherited from his grandfather. Still, he was happy in a way I couldn't understand." Richard paused, running his fingers over the strings of the guitar left by the boy. "We became inseparable. He taught me to play guitar, to fish, to see beauty in things I had never noticed. In return, I shared my books, my toys. One day, near the end of the holidays, we went to the reservoir. It was forbidden to swim there. The current was dangerous after the rains. But I wanted to impress him, to show him I wasn't afraid." Richard's voice choked. I started to drown. Michael jumped in to save me. Even though he wasn't a good swimmer, he managed to push me to the bank, but the current carried him away. Gabriel remained silent, respecting his father's pain. They searched for days. When they found his body... Dad. You don't have to continue, Gabriel interrupted, noticing the growing anguish. Richard took a deep breath. I went back to Manchester after that. I never spoke about Michael again. My parents treated the matter as an unfortunate accident and we moved on. I immersed myself in studies, then in business. I built a fortress around that memory. And now this boy appears, identical to your childhood friend. Richard nodded, holding the guitar tightly. It's no coincidence, Gabriel. During those 5 years, Michael was with me. Not as a memory, but truly with me. In a place between life and non-life, he guided me back. Gabriel studied his father's face. The Richard who awoke from the coma was profoundly different from the man who suffered the accident 5 years earlier. There was a softness in his eyes, a vulnerability that had never been present in the ruthless businessman. Do you believe me? Richard asked. I believe something extraordinary happened, Gabriel replied cautiously. I saw the boy, Dad. I played alongside him. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Beatrice, who entered carrying a folder of documents. How's the hospital's most stubborn patient? She joked, kissing her father's forehead. Impatient to get out of here, Richard replied. Any news about the boy? Beatrice shook her head. Nothing yet, but I have other news we need to discuss. She cast a significant look at Gabriel, who understood the cue. I'll get some coffee, he said, getting up. Be right back. When they were alone, Beatrice sat in the chair beside the bed and opened the folder. Dad, during your absence, I took over the company's direction, as you know. In the first 2 years, I worked alongside Paul following the management model you had established. Richard nodded. Paul was always my right-hand man. I trust him completely. Beatrice hesitated. There's something you need to know. In the 3rd year of your coma, I started noticing inconsistencies in the financial reports of the international division. What kind of inconsistencies? Initially, small discrepancies, numbers that didn't match, contracts with ambiguous clauses. I asked Paul for clarification, but his explanations were never satisfactory. Richard straightened up in bed, his expression subtly changing. For a moment, Beatrice glimpsed the old Richard, the sharp and ruthless executive. Did you investigate? Discreetly, yes. I discovered that Paul had created a parallel structure, shell companies in tax havens, inflated contracts, bribes in public tenders. Richard closed his eyes for a moment. Paul Miller, his friend since university, his business partner for over 30 years. I confronted him 2 years ago, Beatrice continued. He denied everything, of course. When I presented proof, he argued that these were practices you tacitly approved of. And they were, Richard admitted after a long silence. Not directly, but I knew. I chose not to know officially, you understand? That's how big business worked in this country. Beatrice watched her father with a mixture of disappointment and understanding. Paul went much further, Dad. It wasn't just a few bribes to facilitate licenses. He embezzled millions, harmed competitors, intimidated people. What did you do? What I thought was right. I revamped the entire corporate governance. I implemented strict compliance policies. I removed Paul and other executives involved. I reported the irregularities to the authorities, but managed to secure a leniency agreement to preserve the company. Richard remained silent, absorbing the information. The empire he had built had rotten foundations more than he imagined, or allowed himself to admit. That must have been expensive, he finally commented. Financially, yes, very, but the alternative was to watch everything crumble. Morrison Developments today is a smaller company, but more solid and ethical. And the jobs. We preserved most of them. We sold some subsidiaries, cancelled unsustainable projects, but there were no mass layoffs. Richard studied his daughter's face, noticing the determination in her eyes, the same he had at her age, but directed towards nobler purposes. You did the right thing, Beatrice. Better than I would have done. She smiled, relieved. She had feared this conversation since her father awoke. There's still a lot to rebuild, she continued, but we're on the right track. The question is, what do you want to do now? Doctors say that in a few weeks you can return to work if you wish. Richard looked at the guitar beside him, then at the window, where the London skyline stretched under the afternoon sky. I don't know if I want to go back, Beatrice. Not like before. That Richard Morrison was left behind, on the bank of that reservoir in Bath. Before Beatrice could reply, Nurse Denise entered the room. Mr. Morrison, your latest exam results are in. Dr. Ferdinand will be here shortly to discuss them. When the nurse left, Richard turned to his daughter. There's something else you need to know, Beatrice. Something I haven't told anyone, not even your mother or your brothers. The grave tone alarmed Beatrice. What is it, Dad? In the moments before I woke up, when the boy and Gabriel were playing that music, Michael told me something. He said I had a second chance, but that it would come at a price. What price? 1 year, Richard replied. He said I would have 1 year of lucidity to fix everything I broke. 1 year to save my soul. Beatrice frowned. Dad, you just came out of a 5-year coma. It's natural to be confused about some things. I'm not confused, daughter. I've never been so lucid. 1 year is what I have. After that, I don't know what will happen, but I feel Michael was telling the truth. At that moment, Dr. Ferdinand entered the room holding the results of the latest exams. His normally composed face showed signs of concern. Mr. Morrison, Mrs. Beatrice, we have received the results of the advanced MRI. And? Richard asked, already intuiting the answer. The doctor sat down, carefully choosing his words. We found structural changes in the temporal lobe and hippocampus, small, almost imperceptible, but present. Under normal conditions, they would not cause immediate symptoms, but considering my previous condition, they are significant, Richard completed. We will need to monitor you carefully, Dr. Ferdinand continued. There is a possibility of developing memory lapses, behavioral changes, progressive motor difficulties. In how long? Beatrice asked, her voice betraying concern. Impossible to predict precisely. It may be that the symptoms never manifest significantly, or they may progress in months. Richard exchanged a look with Beatrice. 1 year, exactly as Michael had said. Thank you, doctor, he replied calmly. When can I be discharged? Surprised by Richard's tranquility in the face of the diagnosis, the doctor hesitated. With your current recovery, I believe that in a week we can consider hospital discharge, with intensive outpatient follow-up, of course. When the doctor left, Beatrice squeezed her father's hand. We'll get other opinions, the best specialists. Richard smiled serenely. No specialist can change what is written, daughter. 1 year, and I intend to use it well. That night, alone in his hospital room, Richard gently strummed the guitar, picking out the melody he had shared with Michael decades ago. In the dim light, he could almost see his friend sitting in front of him, as in the summers in Bath. I'm ready for our agreement, Michael, he whispered to the empty room. 1 year to fix what I broke, to be the man you knew I could be. Outside, the rain began to fall over London, washing the polluted air. And in Richard Morrison's heart, a determination grew, as strong as the one that had made him build his empire, but this time directed towards a purpose greater than himself. Chapter 5. The Price of Redemption. The headquarters of Morrison Developments, an imposing glass and steel building in the heart of London's financial district, buzzed with anticipation that Monday morning. The chatter in the corridors had a single theme: the return of Richard Morrison after 5 years of absence. Older employees could hardly believe that the legendary founder, thought to be permanently incapacitated, was coming back. In the main lobby, where an austere portrait of Richard dominated the wall, Beatrice waited anxiously. 2 months had passed since the inexplicable awakening, and her father's physical recovery had surprised even the most skeptical doctors. The willpower he once applied to business was now entirely focused on his rehabilitation. When the private elevator opened, it was not the Richard Morrison of old who emerged. The man who walked slowly through the lobby, leaning on a discreet cane, seemed simultaneously more fragile and stronger than the corporate titan everyone remembered. "Dad, are you sure you're ready?" Beatrice asked, adjusting his tie, the first he had worn since the accident. "We could have started with part-time, as Dr. Ferdinand suggested." Richard smiled with a serenity that disconcerted anyone who had known him before. "I have 1 year, Beatrice. I can't waste time." Employees watched from a distance, in a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Many had been hired during his absence and knew only stories about the ruthless founder. "They seem scared," Richard commented, noticing their glances. "Your reputation precedes you," Beatrice replied. "For most, you're more legend than person." Richard nodded, understanding. We're going to change that today. In the main meeting room, the board of directors awaited complete. Familiar faces mixed with new executives hired during the restructuring led by Beatrice. The empty chair at the head of the table, symbolically kept as the founder's chair, waited for Richard. When he entered, everyone stood up. The silence was palpable. "Please sit down," Richard asked, addressing the head of the table. Beatrice took the seat to his right. "First of all, I want to thank each of you for your dedication during my absence, especially my daughter Beatrice, who guided the company through turbulent waters with a wisdom I myself would not have shown." Murmurs of agreement ran around the table. The ethical transformation promoted by Beatrice had gained respect, even at the cost of immediate profits. "I have received detailed reports on the last 5 years," Richard continued. "I have read every document, every balance sheet, every decision made. The company I find today is smaller in numbers, but infinitely greater in integrity than the one I left." He paused, studying each face at the table. "Some of you expect me to reverse decisions made by Beatrice, to resume old practices in the name of profitability. Others fear that I will interfere with the new culture established." Richard smiled slightly. "None of those things will happen." The tension in the room visibly lessened. "The Richard Morrison you knew no longer exists. He was left behind on that avenue on that rainy night. The man before you today has other priorities, another understanding of what success means." Beatrice watched her father with a mixture of pride and surprise. She expected him to show change, but not such a profound and articulated transformation. "I have 2 important announcements," Richard continued. "First, I officially confirm Beatrice Morrison as the company's permanent chief executive officer. I will assume the position of chairman of the board, focusing on strategic guidelines and the expansion of our social programs." Spontaneous applause erupted. Beatrice's leadership had won admirers, especially among younger executives. "Second," Richard continued when the applause ceased, "I call for an extraordinary General Assembly with all employees for next Monday. Everyone, without exception, from the doorman to the board of directors." This request caused astonishment. Morrison Developments had never held an event that brought together all hierarchical levels simultaneously. "Any problem, Mr. Muller?" Richard asked, noticing the finance director's uncomfortable expression. "With all due respect, Mr. Morrison, there are almost 2,000 employees in London alone. Logistically, it would be—" "We will rent the Royal Albert Hall if necessary," Richard interrupted. "And I want former employees who were dismissed in the last 10 years also invited, especially those dismissed under controversial circumstances." A tense silence dominated the room. Everyone knew of the arbitrary and sometimes cruel dismissals that marked Richard's previous era. "Sir, this could expose the company to—" "To what, exactly?" Richard questioned with a glint in his eyes that vaguely resembled his old authority. "The truth? Responsibility for our actions? We are not calling this meeting to receive praise, Mr. Muller." The CFO recoiled, visibly uncomfortable. "Don't worry," Richard continued in a softer tone. "I have no intention of destabilizing the company. On the contrary, I want to build stronger foundations based on transparency and real responsibility. Beatrice has already started this path. We will simply accelerate it." After the meeting, as they walked to Richard's old office, now occupied by Beatrice, she couldn't contain her curiosity. "What exactly is your plan for this assembly, Dad?" Richard smiled enigmatically. "Something I should have done a long time ago." In the office, Richard walked slowly through the space, noticing the changes implemented by his daughter. Where before there was austere and impersonal decor, now there were plants, photographs, and a circular meeting table that replaced the imposing desk he used to maintain distance from his interlocutors. "I like what you've done here," he commented, stopping before the window that offered a panoramic view of London. "Aren't you curious about Paul?" Beatrice asked, referring to the former partner removed for corruption. Richard sighed. "I have enough information in the reports. He betrayed not only my trust, but the basic principles of decency and business. He asks to see you, you know. He calls the hospital our house, says there are explanations he can only give in person. And there will be a time for that," Richard replied, "but not now. I have more important priorities." Among these priorities, Richard mentally listed truly reconciling with his children and Julia, transforming Morrison Development's corporate culture, and continuing his search for the mysterious boy with the guitar. This last obsession remained unshaken. Despite investigators finding no concrete clues about the boy, Richard maintained the conviction that he would find him again. At the end of that day, exhausted but satisfied with his return, Richard met with Claire at the Morrison Cultural Institute, one of the few social initiatives he had sponsored before the accident, more for corporate image than for true commitment. Claire, a visual arts graduate, had taken over the direction of the institute during her father's absence, transforming it from a mere space for elitist exhibitions into a true artistic training center for young people from disadvantaged communities. "You've completely transformed this place," Richard commented, observing the rooms filled with young people in music, visual arts, and theater workshops. "It was just a monument to your ego before," Claire replied, with the frankness that had always characterized her. "Now it has real purpose." Richard smiled at the direct comment. Before the accident, he would have responded coldly to such insolence. Now he appreciated his daughter's raw honesty. "And it didn't cost as much as you thought," Claire continued. "We redirected resources, established partnerships. The money that used to pay for socialite cocktails now maintains scholarships." As they walked through the corridors, Richard noticed a group of children in a guitar class. He stopped, carefully observing each face, as he compulsively did whenever he saw children since his awakening. "He's not here, Dad," Claire said softly, noticing his behavior. "I've checked every new student." Richard nodded, grateful for his daughter's understanding. "You think I'm getting obsessed, don't you?" "I think you received a second chance through something inexplicable. It's natural to want to understand." They continued the tour of the institute, with Claire explaining the various implemented programs. In the end, they sat in the small cafe on the terrace overlooking Hyde Park. "I want to expand this," Richard suddenly declared. "Not just this institute, but the concept. Create centers like this in every region where Morrison Developments has projects." Claire raised her eyebrows, surprised. "That would cost millions, Dad." "Money we have," he simply replied. "What we lacked was purpose." That night, upon returning to the family home in Belgravia, where he had moved after leaving the hospital, abandoning the bachelor penthouse where he lived before the accident, Richard felt a different kind of fatigue than the physical exhaustion of rehabilitation. Julia awaited him in the living room, concern evident on her face. "Doctor, Ferdinand called," she said as soon as he entered. "You missed your follow-up appointment today." Richard cursed softly. He had completely forgotten the commitment. "I was at the institute with Claire," he explained, leaving his cane on the side table. "We lost track of time." Julia studied her husband attentively. "Are you all right? You look pale." "Just tired," he replied, but something in his eyes betrayed more. She approached, gently touching his face, a gesture of intimacy that would have been unthinkable in the formal marriage they maintained before the accident. "Richard, you need to tell me if something is wrong. The doctors warned about possible symptoms." He hesitated. In the morning, during the board meeting, he had a moment of confusion. Familiar names suddenly escaped his memory. For a few seconds, he hadn't recognized the face of a director he had worked with for decades. "I had a small lapse today," he finally admitted. "Nothing serious." Julia led him to the sofa, sitting beside him. In recent months since the miraculous awakening, the two had slowly rediscovered each other. The decades of estrangement gave way to a renewed complicity, nurtured both by shared trauma and by Richard's evident transformation. "What did the doctor say about these lapses?" she asked. "That they are expected, part of the process." Richard hesitated again. "Ju, do you believe I only have 1 year?" The question caught her by surprise. Beatrice had shared with her mother the strange prophecy Richard attributed to the boy Michael. "I believe something extraordinary happened to you," Julia replied carefully. "Something beyond medical or rational comprehension. If that included some kind of deadline, I don't know, but I know you believe it." "And does that belief make me crazy in your eyes?" Julia smiled, stroking her husband's hand. "After what we witnessed in that hospital room, nothing seems impossible to me anymore." The phone rang, interrupting the moment. It was Gabriel calling from Manchester. "Dad, I just spoke with the conservatory director. He loved the scholarship program idea. Said we can start selecting students next semester." Richard smiled. The scholarship program for young musicians from disadvantaged communities was his first initiative after taking over as chairman of the board. Inspired by Gabriel and the music that reconnected him to life, the project would offer complete musical training for 100 young people annually. "Great news, son. I'll transfer the funds tomorrow." "I'm coming back to London this weekend," Gabriel continued. "I have a surprise for you." After hanging up, Richard felt a sharp pang in his right temple. Headaches became more frequent in recent weeks, though he tried to hide it from everyone. "You need to rest," Julia said, noticing his uncomfortable expression. "Tomorrow you have the meeting with the Foundation Board." The newly created Morrison Foundation for Social Development was another project born from Richard's transformation. Using a significant part of his personal fortune, the institution would focus on education, culture, and environmental sustainability. "I need to finish the presentation for Monday's assembly," Richard argued. "You can do that tomorrow. Now rest." As he prepared for bed, Richard felt that unsettling sensation again, as if time was slipping through his fingers. Of the 12 months prophesied by Michael, almost 3 had already passed, and the symptoms the doctor predicted were beginning to manifest, albeit subtly. In the room before falling asleep, he played a few notes on the guitar the boy had left. The melody, now so familiar, seemed imbued with a meaning he was still trying to fully decipher. "Where are you, Michael?" he murmured to the empty room. "What else do I need to do?" The following Monday, the Royal Albert Hall was packed. More than 2,000 Morrison Developments employees, plus hundreds of former collaborators who accepted the unusual invitation, waited anxiously. Rumors about the purpose of the meeting had circulated for days. Some feared mass layoffs, others speculated about the sale of the company. In the makeshift dressing room, Beatrice watched her father with concern. He looked paler than usual and occasionally massaged his temples. "Are you sure you want to do this?" she asked. "I can take over the presentation." Richard shook his head. "It has to be me, Beatrice. These are my responsibilities, my mistakes." When Richard Morrison stepped onto the stage, leaning discreetly on his cane, the silence was immediate. For many present, it was the first time they had personally seen the living legend, or reborn, as some called him. "Good morning, everyone," he began, his clear voice amplified by the sound system. "I am here not to speak, but to listen. The music you have created, the talent you have developed, that is far more valuable than any speech I could offer." A murmur ran through the audience. It was not the start they expected. "I convened this meeting for a simple reason: to apologize." The silence deepened, now filled with shock and disbelief. "For decades, I built Morrison Developments with a flawed philosophy. I confused success with power, profit with value. I created a culture of fear and intimidation, where questioning was seen as weakness and human consideration as an obstacle to progress." Richard paused, looking directly at the audience. "I know many of you suffered under my leadership. Unjust dismissals, public humiliations, unbearable pressures. Some lost their health, relationships, dignity. For these, my words are insufficient, but still necessary. I am deeply sorry." In the front row, veteran executives shifted uncomfortably. Richard's public confession exposed not only his errors, but a system in which everyone had participated. "My daughter Beatrice initiated an essential transformation in this company in recent years. Today I announce that we will accelerate and deepen that change." Over the next 2 hours, Richard detailed a comprehensive plan. Review of all dismissals from the last 10 years with compensation for unfair cases, implementation of rigorous wellness and work-life balance policies, creation of an ethics council with employee participation at all levels, massive investments in environmental sustainability, and a complete overhaul of the salary policy to reduce internal inequality. Finally, Richard concluded, visibly tired but determined, "I announced the creation of the Second Chance program, offering professional training and employment opportunities for people in vulnerable situations, because everyone deserves a new opportunity, just as I received mine." The speech was initially met with stunned silence, followed by hesitant applause that gradually grew in volume and enthusiasm. Younger employees, who did not carry the weight of the old culture, were the first to show their appreciation. Gradually, others joined. As he left the stage, Richard felt a sudden dizziness. His vision darkened momentarily, and he had to lean on Beatrice. "Dad?" she asked, alarmed. "I'm fine," he murmured, recovering quickly. "Just emotional," but both knew it was more than that. The invisible deadline continued to run. and the symptoms gradually became more frequent and intense. The price of redemption was beginning to manifest physically. That night, as the media reported on the extraordinary speech of the reborn magnate, as the newspapers called him, Richard sat alone in his garden, the guitar on his lap, softly playing the melody of his childhood. "Am I on the right path, Michael?" he asked the silent night. "Is this what you wanted from me?" Only the wind answered, gently moving the leaves of the trees. But in his heart, Richard felt a growing certainty. Time might be running out for him, but every day was an opportunity to repair the damage he had caused. And in that, he found a peace he had never known as the powerful and feared Richard Morrison of before. Chapter 6. The Last Song. The London winter arrived with an unusual chill that year. 9 months had passed since Richard Morrison's inexplicable awakening, and the city that had witnessed his rise, fall, and rebirth now observed his deepest transformation. In Brixton, a vibrant community in South London, a new building stood out among the diverse constructions, the Michael Sterling Educational Centre. Opened just 3 months earlier, the complex already served over 500 children with complementary education programs, cultural workshops, and social assistance. Richard walked slowly through the centre's corridors, leaning more heavily on his cane than some months before. His body, initially resilient after awakening, was beginning to show increasing frailties. Headaches became more intense, memory lapses more frequent, and occasionally his right hand trembled uncontrollably. "Mr. Richard, the children are waiting in the auditorium," informed Mrs. Zena, the pedagogical coordinator hired from the community itself, one of Richard's many decisions that valued local knowledge over academic credentials. "Thank you, Zena. I'm on my way." The auditorium, a multi-purpose space with capacity for 200 people, was filled with eager children. They were students of the music program, about to give their first formal presentation after 3 months of classes. Among guitars, flutes, drums, and some orchestral instruments donated by Gabriel's conservatory, the young musicians tuned their instruments with admirable concentration. Gabriel, who coordinated the music program as a volunteer, approached his father. "Nervous?" he asked with a smile. "More than them, apparently," Richard replied, observing the children's tranquility. "You've created something special here, Dad. Something that will last." Richard nodded, feeling that familiar mix of pride and urgency that constantly accompanied him in recent months. The more time passed, the more desperately he worked to leave a legacy different from the corporate empire he had built. The Educational Centre was just one of many projects he had implemented. The Morrison Foundation already funded similar programs in 3 counties, focusing on communities where the company had carried out large developments in the past, often at the cost of forced evictions and social conflicts. At the company, the revolution initiated by Beatrice and accelerated by Richard transformed Morrison developments into a reference for ethical governance and social responsibility, although some shareholders still resisted changes that impacted immediate profits. Richard, now only chairman of the board, had left executive management entirely in his daughter's hands. "It's time to begin," Gabriel announced, interrupting his father's thoughts. "Do you want to say a few words first?" Richard walked to the center of the small stage. The simple lights illuminated his face, revealing to the attentive audience the marks of time and the silently advancing illness. Still, his eyes maintained a vibrant sparkle that contrasted with his physical fragility. "Good evening, everyone," he began, his voice hoarser than a few months earlier. "I am here not to speak, but to listen. The music you have created, the talent you have developed, that is far more valuable than any speech I could offer." The children smiled, some waving excitedly. To them, Richard was just the kind gentleman who founded the centre, not the feared businessman of the past. "I just want to say that every note you play today is a reminder that the future is in your hands, and that I believe with all my heart in the transformative potential that each of you carries." Gabriel, noticing his father's growing emotion, took command. "Let's start our presentation. First, our choir will perform Aquarella by Toquinho." The children began to sing, their voices filling the auditorium with a purity that deeply moved Richard. Sitting in the front row, he observed each face, unconsciously searching for those familiar features that had haunted him since his awakening. The boy with the guitar, Michael, had never been found. Despite the investigators' efforts, Richard's personal searches and discreet announcements in newspapers and community radios, the boy seemed to have simply disappeared, or, as Richard suspected in his most reflective moments, had never existed on the material plane. After several presentations, the moment Richard most awaited arrived. Gabriel took the stage with his cello, accompanied by Louise, a 10-year-old girl who had shown extraordinary talent on the guitar. "To conclude our evening," Gabriel announced, "Louise and I will perform a very special song, a melody that holds deep meaning for my family, especially for my father." Richard straightened in his chair, immediately recognizing the first chords. It was the Reservoir song, the melody he had shared with the Michael of his childhood, the same one the mysterious boy had played in the hospital, bringing him back to life. As the notes filled the auditorium, Richard closed his eyes, letting himself be transported. For a fleeting moment, he was once again at the edge of the reservoir in Bath. Two boys dreaming of the future, sharing secrets and melodies under the open sky. A future where one would save the other, in ways neither could imagine. When he reopened his eyes, something paralyzed him. In the last row of the auditorium, partially hidden by the dim light, sat a boy, watching attentively. A boy with curly hair and deep eyes, holding what appeared to be a small guitar. Richard's heart pounded. With difficulty, he rose from his chair, leaning heavily on his cane. No one seemed to notice his agitation, all mesmerized by the beauty of the performance. With faltering steps, Richard began to walk toward the back of the auditorium, his eyes fixed on the boy. The closer he got, the more certain he became. It was him, the same boy from the hospital, the same face Claire had found in the park, the same serene expression that had accompanied him during the 5 years of coma. But when he was just a few meters away, Richard's vision momentarily darkened. An intense dizziness forced him to stop, leaning on an empty chair. When he regained focus, the boy was no longer there. "Michael," Richard called, his voice lost in the music. "Michael, please." Ignoring his increasing weakness, Richard hurried to the nearest exit. In the outer corridor, he glimpsed a small silhouette turning the corner. He followed it with all the speed his debilitated body allowed. Dad, where are you going?" Gabriel's voice barely registered in his focused consciousness. Richard continued, determined not to lose the boy again. He turned the corner, finding a long, empty hallway. At the end, a half-open door let in the silver light of the moon. Richard stepped through the door, finding himself in the small community garden that the center's children had planted. Under the moonlight, the boy awaited, sitting peacefully on a wooden bench. "Michael," Richard whispered, approaching slowly, fearing the boy would disappear again. "You found me," the boy replied with a serene smile. "But I was always here." Richard sat beside him, his body trembling not only from emotion, but from the increasingly evident symptoms of his illness. "Why did you disappear? Why did you leave me searching for so long?" The boy tilted his head slightly. "I never disappeared, Richard. I was with you every moment, as I always have been." "Are you really him, Michael Sterling, the boy from the reservoir?" In response, the boy merely smiled, a smile that transported Richard instantly back to those summers in Bath, to the friendship that had defined his childhood before ambition and power transformed him. "The deadline is coming to an end, isn't it?" Richard asked, feeling the familiar pang in his temple, more intense than ever. "You always knew it would be this way," Michael replied. "1 year to fix what you broke, to save your soul." "And did I succeed? Did I do enough?" The boy gently touched Richard's hand. "You transformed pain into healing, Richard. Not just for others, but for yourself." A wave of sudden weakness swept through Richard's body. His vision darkened again, more prolonged this time. When it cleared, he saw Gabriel running towards him, alarmed. "Dad, what happened? You just left in the middle of the performance." Richard looked around. The boy had disappeared again, but this time Richard felt a strange peace. "I'm fine, Gabriel. Just needed some fresh air." Gabriel didn't seem convinced. His father's pale face, the more pronounced tremor in his hands, his momentarily unfocused eyes, all signs the family had learned to monitor in recent months. "I'll call Beatrice to take you home. You need to rest." Richard didn't protest. The sight of Michael, however brief, had brought him a sense of closure, of a cycle completed. The rest of the night passed in a blur of worried faces, words of comfort, and finally the comfort of his bed in the family home. In the following weeks, Richard's condition deteriorated rapidly. Doctors, unable to explain the sudden acceleration of symptoms, recommended hospitalization, but he vehemently refused. "I want to stay home with my family," he insisted, a determination reminiscent of the old Richard. One morning, while having coffee on the balcony with Julia, he made an unexpected request. "I want to see Gabriel play at the Royal Opera House." Julia frowned. "Gabriel doesn't have any scheduled performances at the Royal Opera House, dear." "Then organize one, a charity recital, to raise funds for the educational center." The urgency in Richard's voice was impossible to ignore. Julia nodded, knowing that time was running out faster than anyone dared to admit. 3 weeks later, the recital became a reality. The Royal Opera House in London, a historic stage for London's cultural elite, opened its doors for a charity event organized by the Morrison Foundation. The program featured young talents from Brixton performing alongside professional musicians, including Gabriel Morrison, now recognized as a promising cellist and music educator. Richard insisted on sitting in the front row, despite his family's protests about his fragile state. Even in a wheelchair, impeccably dressed in his best suit, he maintained a dignity that commanded respect. "Music has always been present in the most important moments of my life," he commented to Julia, as they awaited the start of the show. "At first with Michael, then through Gabriel, and finally with the boy in the hospital." Julia squeezed his hand affectionately. After 11 months since the miraculous awakening, she had learned to accept Richard's visions, not as delusions, but as personal truths that transcended rational understanding. Beatrice and Claire joined them moments before the lights dimmed. The Morrison family, once fractured by the emotional distance imposed by Richard, now united around the transformed patriarch, instinctively knowing that every moment was precious. When Gabriel took the stage for his solo performance, the entire theatre plunged into silent anticipation. Positioning his cello, he looked directly at his father in the front row and announced, "This piece is an original composition, inspired by a melody my father taught me as a child. It's called Second Chance." The first chords were familiar. The bass was clearly the Reservoir song, but Gabriel had expanded the simple melody into a complex and deeply emotional composition, incorporating elements that told a story of loss, redemption, and rebirth. Richard closed his eyes, letting the music envelop him completely. In his mind, images flowed like water. The face of young Michael smiling by the reservoir, the frightened look of his friend disappearing into the current, the faces of his children as youngsters, lost moments of their childhoods that he had sacrificed for work, the accident, the darkness of the coma where Michael visited him daily, the awakening, the transformation, and finally, the legacy he built each day with the time he had left. When the piece reached its final movement, Richard opened his eyes. He felt tears stream down his face without any embarrassment. And then, at the edge of his vision, he noticed a movement. Turning his head slightly, he saw, sitting a few chairs to the right, the boy Michael, smiling calmly as he listened to the music. This time Richard did not react. He did not try to reach him or call him. He just smiled back, a smile of recognition and gratitude. As the music reached its emotional climax, Richard understood a fundamental truth. Michael, whether he was a spiritual manifestation, a creation of his mind, or something human language could not define, had never truly been absent. He had been present in every important moment, silently guiding him, first as a childhood friend, then as a guardian during the coma, and finally as the catalyst for his transformation. The last note resonated through the theatre, followed by a moment of reverent silence before the audience erupted in applause. Gabriel bowed in gratitude, his eyes meeting his father's. In that look, everything they had never been able to express in words was silently communicated. 2 weeks later, on a sunny spring afternoon, Richard Morrison peacefully left this world, surrounded by his family, exactly 12 months after his inexplicable awakening. The deadline Michael had announced was fulfilled with mathematical precision. The farewell ceremony took place in the garden of the Michael Sterling Educational Center, as per his explicit request. There were no luxurious wreaths or pompous speeches, only music, a lot of music performed by the project's children, by Gabriel and by musicians who volunteered to honor the man who in the last months of his life had transformed not only his own existence, but that of hundreds of people. Among those present, contrasting figures shared space. Executives in impeccable suits alongside Brixton residents. Former employees Richard had personally dismissed alongside young people who had never known the old Richard. Politicians and celebrities mixed with teachers from the centre and children from the music programme. Paul Miller, the former partner removed for corruption, attended discreetly, keeping his distance. In the weeks before his passing, Richard finally granted him a private meeting. No one but the two knew what was discussed, but Paul left the encounter visibly shaken, and days later announced the creation of his own foundation focused on corporate transparency and combating corruption. After the ceremony, as the crowd slowly dispersed, a solitary figure remained observing from a distance, partially hidden under the shade of a large mango tree at the edge of the grounds. A boy of approximately 10 years old, with curly hair and a small guitar on his back. Claire was the first to notice him. With a tranquil smile, she discreetly pointed him out to Beatrice and Gabriel. The three siblings watched in silence as the boy, realizing he had been seen, smiled gently before turning and walking away, gradually disappearing among the trees. None of them tried to follow him or call him. Some silent understanding had settled, a knowledge that transcended rational explanations, but which brought peace to their hearts. 1 year later, on the first anniversary of Richard's passing, the Morrison Foundation unveiled a statue in the central courtyard of the Educational Centre. The sculpture, created by a talented artist from Brixton, depicted two boys holding hands by the edge of a river, one holding a small guitar. The plaque beneath the statue bore a simple inscription, personally chosen by Richard before his passing. "It is not time that defines a life, but the love and good we sow during our journey." That night, after the inauguration ceremony, Gabriel found himself alone in the courtyard, observing the statue illuminated by the moon. Without an audience, without expectations, purely out of personal impulse, he positioned his cello and began to play the Reservoir song in its simplest and purest form. As he played, he could have sworn he heard, harmonizing perfectly with his cello, the distant and soft sound of a guitar, played by invisible hands in the quiet night. Dear listeners, we hope Richard and Michael's story has deeply touched your hearts. To continue experiencing emotions like this, we have a special playlist with other narratives that explore second chances and personal transformations. Find it by clicking here. If this journey of redemption awakened something in you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and share your own transformation experiences in the comments. Every day, we bring stories that, like unforgettable melodies, echo in our souls long after the last chord. We hope to meet you again in our next narrative.